Once upon a time, there was a dangerous seacoast where shipwrecks would often occur. And on that seacoast, there was a little life-saving station that was attached to a lighthouse. And it was a primitive building. They only had one boat. But the members of this life-saving station were committed. They kept a constant watch over the ocean. And anytime a ship went down, these heroes would unselfishly head out onto the waters in their little boat, day or night, to save shipwrecked people. Now, because so many lives were saved by this little life-saving station that was attached to the lighthouse, suddenly it started to become famous. They saved so many people, it started to become famous, and so more people started volunteering to help. They wanted to be a part of this amazing, life-changing thing. And so the life-saving station grew. It got bigger and bigger, but some of the volunteers were unhappy that it seemed so primitive. Our building is small and primitive, and so they started to upgrade the building. Emergency cots became beds. Better furniture came into their bigger and newly decorated life-saving station. Now, as time went on, the life-saving station, the people, it became a popular gathering place for the volunteers, even when there was no emergency. There was no shipwreck, but still the people liked to get together to fellowship. And when they got together, it was so obvious that these volunteers loved each other. They were so good at taking care of people. But fewer and fewer volunteers wanted to actually go out onto the ocean. That was dangerous. That was wet and gross and soggy. And so they started hiring lifeboat crews to go out onto the water for them, and they would just stay inside. Now, about this time, there was a large boat that wrecked just off the coast, and the hired crews brought in boatloads of people, tons of cold, wet, dirty, sick, half-drowned people. And the beautiful life-saving station became suddenly a place of chaos. The plush carpets got wet. The furniture got scratched. Now, about this time, at the next meeting, the group of volunteers were divided. Some of the members literally wanted to stop trying to save people. They wanted to stop their life-saving activity because it was damaging their beautiful building that they had worked so hard to build up. And then members insisted, well, that's the whole point of having a life-saving station attached to the lighthouse, was to help people. And so, but those members got voted down. And they were told, look, if you want to go out on the ocean and help people, then you can build your own life-saving station up the coast. So that's exactly what they did. A small band of people moved up the coast and built a little humble shack with one boat, and they started all over, resumed their life-saving activities of bringing in shipwrecked passengers. As the years went by, a new station experienced the exact same changes that happened in the first one. They grew, and they became noteworthy, and they became bigger, and it evolved into a place to meet regularly for fellowship and committee meetings and even special trainings about their mission, but very few people actually went out onto the ocean to save any drowned people. Drowned people were not welcome. They might make the carpet wet. They might scratch the furniture, or God forbid, they might bring noisy children with them. And so, another life-saving station was founded just up the coast. And they would resume their life-saving work on the ocean. And history continued to repeat itself. If you visit that coastline today, you will find many beautiful meeting halls with lots of ample parking and plush carpeting and not very many people. There are still lots of shipwrecks in that area of the ocean, but most people just drown. Today is the second sermon in our sermon series called Road to Rome Part 3. We are entering in the third installment of our journey through the book of Romans. And for January, we're diving into chapters 9 through 12. Now, last week we started with chapter 9, and this week we're into chapter 10, which goes like this. Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. See, you might remember from last week that Paul is writing a letter to the church in Rome, and we saw two big things. Number one, Paul is a Jewish person, and so he has a huge heart for the Jewish people. He's very emotionally invested in helping his people. But the second thing we realize is that the second thing is that God is changing the system. It used to be about a system of sacrifices and bloodlines, but now it's all about Jesus. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the light. Only through Jesus can you come to the Father. Can you have a relationship with God? And so what Paul is saying is the Jewish people have passion. They have so much passion, and passion is good, but it's aimed in the wrong direction. They're passionate about this list of rules instead of passionate about a relationship with Jesus, which is what we need to be passionate about. Does that feel familiar to us? How many of us have had that temptation to think that Christianity is all about following this list of rules instead of having a connection to Jesus? And so it continues in verse 3, and it says, since they did not know the righteousness of God, and they sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there might be righteousness for everyone who believes. It says they did not know the righteousness of God, so they sought to establish their own. Now think about this. They did not know the righteousness of God, talking about Jesus, so they sought to establish their own. Let me ask you a tricky question. Can you be a good person and not be a Christian? Yeah, right? Like, almost, of course, right? We answer almost knee-jerk reaction. Of course, we all know atheists or agnostics or other types of unchurched people who are not Christian, and yet they're really good people. So let me ask a follow-up. How do we find the definition of good? Where are we getting that definition of good? Because for Christians, Jesus is our standard. Jesus is our guide. Without Jesus, people seek to establish their own righteousness. And the problem is that we are creating a definition of good that has no basis. It has no concrete foundation. You're just kind of making it up as you go based on what you feel. They're a good person because I feel like they're a good person right now. And that leads to a society where the definition of good varies dramatically depending on who you're talking to and what's important to them. There's actually a word for that. We call it moral relativism, where morality is relative depending on who you're talking to. And it changes as you talk to people. And in that society, which is the one we live in that society, it is very difficult to nail down objective foundational good and bad. There are no absolutes in that culture. One of the biggest examples, I think, comes from the Me Too movement. You guys remember what that is, right? Me Too movement. It was a couple of years ago. We have become very aware of the problems with our cultural sexual ethic. Our culture, decades ago, looked at Christianity and they said, we don't really like your rules about sex. We're going to go make our own system of rules. And it didn't go very well. Recently, we have discovered that it's a terrible system. The boundaries of good and bad that our culture made up, it's terrible. It's a system that covers up abuse. It targets victims, and there are no absolutes. We sought to create our own righteousness away from God's righteousness, and it did not go well. Paul is trying to tell them that Christ is the culmination of the law so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. Now, verses 5 through 8 are all about how this message is really obvious. He's like, this message is right in front of you. You don't got to go up to heaven. You don't got to go down to the pit. Jesus is right in front of you. This message is obvious. And then it says in verse 9 and 10, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. That's kind of the core right there. That's the good stuff, right? Now, verse 9, in your heart you believe and are justified. With your mouth you profess and are saved. So there's two parts to that. Believe with your heart, profess with your mouth, right? So there's actions on the outside that have to line up with a belief on the inside. So let me ask another tricky question. Is it more important to help people or to tell them about Jesus? Is it more important? See, it's funny because some of you are like, we totally know the answer. Psh, that's an easy answer. And then you come up with something different than the person sitting next to you. Is it more important to help people or to tell them about Jesus? So, so let me tell you a story. Years ago, I was at a different church, and I had a young couple come into my church, and they'd been living in a motel for a couple of weeks, and they were out of money. They had nothing left to give. And now he had a job lined up. It was a really good, high-paying job, but he had just started, so he wasn't going to see a paycheck for a couple of weeks. And they told me right from the beginning, she was very pregnant. Now, they weren't married, but they were living together in his truck. And they admitted from the beginning, in this church, it was a larger church, we used to run background checks and do all that kind of stuff when people came in asking for help. And so we told them that, and so they were very upfront with us. And they admitted from the beginning that they moved into our area because they were running away from a really bad drug situation back home. They were trying to get clean because they were having a baby, and they wanted to get away from that world. So they moved away, and they moved into our area. And they were out of money, and they needed help. And so we decided as a church to help this young couple. And so we actually had a widow in our church who had a spare bedroom. She opened up her home to these two strangers and brought them into her home and gave them a place to stay. And then we went over to the motel, and we made a deal with them, and we paid their motel bill. And then we got them groceries, and then we started making them meals, and then we got them gas for their truck, and we started taking care of them. We got her to her doctor's appointments. Being homeless is very stressful, and that stress was really bad for the pregnancy, and so they were really concerned. The doctors were really worried, but we gave her that security that she needed to get back on track with her pregnancy, and she was okay. That baby was going to be okay because of our efforts. And then we went further. We started looking at housing. We got them into government assistance, and then we found them a really nice new apartment, and then we moved them into that apartment, and then we furnished that apartment. I put it in front of the congregation. I said, hey, who's got a couch? You know, who's got a TV in your basement that you don't need? Let's provide for this young couple. That church was incredible. They came alive, and that couple was completely overwhelmed. They were so grateful for everything that we did for them. And so, this took place over a couple of months, right? And during this time, I was riding in the car with a colleague of mine. She was a leader in a church, not my church, a different church. But she and I were going somewhere together, and she was driving, and I was gushing. You know, I was just so proud of the church, and I was like, oh my gosh, we're doing all this stuff, and I'm so proud of the church, and they're doing all this great stuff, and it's amazing. And then I told her, I said, I'm really excited, but I haven't had the chance to talk to them about Jesus yet. And my friend looked at me really weird. She's like, why would you need to talk to them about Jesus? Maybe you've already done God's work. So I shrugged. We were busy doing something else, so I shrugged and I moved on. Now, a couple months later, a little boy was born, healthy, safe, and drug-free, which was so vital for us. That's a huge problem where I used to be. And they attended the church once or twice to say thank you, but they didn't really get involved. Their involvement kind of fizzled. But I didn't worry about it because we had already done God's work, right? We had already helped them. We already did the important part. Now, I got to tell them a little bit about Jesus, but I had my friend's voice in the back of my head, right? I don't want to be that weird Christian, right? So I didn't push. And so I never really shared the gospel with them. A couple more months later, we're about a year in at this point. We hadn't heard from them in a while. And so we reached out. How you guys doing? Is everything okay? How's the baby? Turns out he had fallen back into patterns of domestic abuse, and he had gotten arrested. And she took the baby and fled back home. You remember the home that she ran away from because of the drug problem. And last I heard, she was living with a much older man back in that drug-filled world with her baby, and the father was in prison. Is it more important to help someone or to tell them about Jesus? Is it more important to believe with your heart or to profess with your lips? Is it more important to give someone a Band-Aid or to give them healing? And the answer, of course, is both. We need both. We need to provide real-world solutions to the problems that evil has caused in our world, but we also need to show people the source of their problems. We need to treat the symptoms, but also deal with the original sin. We've got to combat both. We need to help people and tell them about Jesus. Otherwise, all this stuff we do in church is just a Band-Aid without healing. And it will not last. Now, verse 14. And I should mention, that kind of stuff can make pastors really bitter, and it can make us really kind of cynical. But thankfully, in my ministry, for every one of those stories, I've got a dozen where it does work out, and people come to know Jesus, and they have this incredible life, and they transform their world. So I don't want you to feel too bad. Verse 14 kind of shifts the tone. Paul gets away from what the message is, and now he's talking about how do you get it to people. And he says, and Paul can't help himself. He's just got to be a little sassy sometimes. And he says in verse 14, how then can they call on the one that they don't believe in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? Can't call on Jesus if you don't believe in him. You can't believe in him if you never heard about it. You can't hear about him if nobody's telling him. So the really obvious response from verse 14 is go tell people about Jesus. Right? Go tell people about Jesus. Now I know what you're thinking. Pastor JJ, that's your job. Right? That's why we pay you the big bucks. You tell people about Jesus. I don't want to. Nobody told us that we might have to go and tell people about Jesus. And that's a good point. Let's keep reading in verse 15. And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? And as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. So let's make it official. This is me, your pastor, officially sending you. Go tell people about Jesus with words from your mouth. And then there's something about having cute feet. And if you if you want me to tell people about Jesus, I love to do that. Please bring them here. Right? But seriously, if you're struggling to talk to people about God, if you're struggling to share that relationship, a baby step is that you can invite people here. I love to do that kind of stuff. I've been practicing. I like to tell people about Jesus. The good news this morning is that God provides healing. In your life, we need both Band-Aids and healing. We need work on the inside of our life and on the outside of our life. The world will give you Band-Aids, and they will work for a little while. The Band-Aids of the world do work temporarily, but for most of us, the root of our problem is that we have a heart that is far away from God. And so we need healing that comes from God. Now, I am not saying if you pray to Jesus, all your problems will be solved, because that's not how that works. But I am saying if you don't pray to Jesus, your problems will be right back. They're going to come right back on. Only through God can he provide real healing. Band-Aids are easy. Real forgiveness takes longer, but it lasts forever. And so the response is pretty basic. In this crazy, broken world, tell people about Jesus and help them. Seek both Band-Aids and healing. One without the other is incomplete. Do not be fooled by a world that tries to get you to choose between those two. Right? Now, some religious traditions are known for one or the other. Right? They have a reputation. For example, Baptists are very well known for telling people about Jesus. That's their thing. Baptists are amazing evangelists. On the other hand, Methodists are really bad at that. Methodists are really bad. That's a weak spot for Methodists, is that we're bad evangelists. But Methodists are really good at taking care of people. That's our strength. We're really good at meeting people's practical needs, and we should be proud of that. That's amazing. It's a beautiful thing, the way we take care of each other. But without the healing and the redemption that comes from a relationship with Jesus, it becomes a Band-Aid. And so what happens in those churches is that it's the same people that keep coming back for help over and over and over. And really, the church transforms into nothing more than a nonprofit. And nothing wrong with nonprofits, but that's not what we are. We are a place of healing and transformation. You don't have to choose one or the other. Now, we talked about this last week, back in November. We called it the tyranny of the or. Right? The world tries to get you to choose. They set things up as if you have to choose one or the other. But we can fight against that. I want you to throw away the word or and embrace the freedom of the and. Right? God, do this and that. Band-Aids and helping people, helping someone and sharing the love of Jesus. Believe in your heart and profess with your lips. Some religious traditions are known for one or the other. Some churches are churches that help people, And other churches are churches that are always talking about Jesus. I'm trying to show you, you don't have to choose. We could be the church that is committed to both, because that's how you change the world. The application should be super obvious. Tell people about Jesus and help people. So step 1, tell people about Jesus using words from your mouth. Okay? Tell people about Jesus. Now, maybe that's intimidating for you. There's a whole big chunk of you in the room that have probably never shared the gospel with anyone before, and that's okay. All right? I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad. It's uncomfortable. It's hard. I'm in the same boat. I was raised Methodist. I don't know how to do this either, but I have discovered that it is what is missing, right? We're not good at this. We are good at helping people, so we need to learn how to do the other side. We need to learn how to tell people about Jesus. Paul made it super obvious. In chapter 10, it's all about you got to tell people about Jesus. And so let me offer this advice if you've never done this before. Start with your story. Start with how God has worked in your life. Even if God, God has been present in every single one of your lives. Even if it's been subtle and behind the scenes, God has been working in your life. And so look at your life. Where has God been working? The chances are you don't even know that God's been working because you've never looked at your life that way. But if you look close, you can see how God has been working. Look again. Look closer. Find God in the hidden coincidences of your life. You can tell, if you can tell people how Jesus has changed your life, you will be infinitely more effective at reaching other people. It's literally a story based on the evidence of your life. You see, some of you in the room have phenomenal testimonies, and you know it. You have great stories of how God has worked in your life, and I've been blessed to hear some of those testimonies. The rest of you have incredible testimonies. You just don't know it yet. You have not discovered the way that God has worked in your life, but I promise you, I guarantee God has been working in the background of your life all along. So go searching for that. Find it. So start with your story. And then the second part, when you're telling people about Jesus, is use your words. I keep saying that, but you got to use your words to talk about it. I've got some wonderful friends. They feel like talking to Jesus is a little awkward. And so they say something like, well, you know what? I'll just plant a seed with my actions, right? I'll just do nice stuff. And maybe they'll understand that God loves them, right? Maybe they will put it together that Jesus loves them. No, that does not work. I understand why people want to do that, but it doesn't work. In our culture, in our world, they are not connecting those dots. They don't see how that connects. You have to draw the line for them. You have to tell people, I'm here doing nice things in the world because I follow Jesus. And I follow Jesus because he has transformed my life, and here's how. That's what we have to connect those dots for people. Because if all you do is do nice stuff in the world, and hope that people put it together, all you've done is give them a fantastic Band-Aid. And they just think that you're a really nice guy or a girl, right? They just think that he's so nice, and they don't get the healing. They don't get the connection to Jesus. So step 1, tell people about Jesus. Step 2, help people. Make a difference in the lives of the people around you. Change someone's life. The way Jesus works in our life is that it should inspire us to make a difference in other people's lives. We don't have to be people of either or. We can be people of both. People who transform lives and bring people closer to Jesus. There once was a social experiment performed at a place called Rockford College. Now, there were 3 phases to the experiment, right? They got a bunch of college students to volunteer for this big psych test. And what it was an auditorium full of people, and then there was one blindfolded volunteer. Now, the blindfolded volunteer had one job. He didn't know it. Everyone else knew, but the blindfolded volunteer did not know what they were supposed to do. Now, there was one task that they needed to accomplish. The goal was to get them to walk to the back of the auditorium and hug the instructor, hug the professor, right? And so in the first round, they had everybody up in the bleachers, and the blindfolded volunteer was down on the floor. And they put the guy who had the right instructions in the middle of the bleachers, surrounded by other people who were shouting contrary instructions. So they bring in the volunteer, they blindfold him, and then they say, go! And the room fills with shouting, and everybody's yelling, and the blindfolded volunteer was completely paralyzed. They could not understand anything. They could not discern. I mean, the room just exploded with noise and all the instructions were blurring together. They didn't know what to do. And so the volunteer just kind of like moved around randomly and without purpose. They had no idea what they were supposed to do. Round 2, same deal. Everybody's in the pews or up in the auditorium. But then they brought down 2 people who were allowed to stand right next to the blindfolded volunteer. One who had the correct instructions and one who was giving contrary instructions. Their goal was to get them away from the right? Give them the wrong instructions. And then they said, go. And all the shouting commences again, and it was chaos. But the volunteer could hear the people who were right next to him. He actually listened to the 2 people on each side. Problem was, he didn't know which one to listen to. So he would listen to one for a little while and then would switch and listen to the other one. He didn't know who to choose, and so he just kind of moved back and forth. But it was very obvious he could hear them. Couldn't hear any of the people in the pew, I keep saying pews, up in the auditorium. But he could hear the people who were right next to him. Phase 3, round 3 of this big psychological experiment that they were doing. Same exact thing as round 2, except the good guy could touch the blindfolded volunteer. Now, you couldn't pull him or force him or drag him or anything, but you could do gentle, reassuring, encourage with light contact. That's what the instructions were. They could encourage with light contact. And for the 3rd time, the blindfolded volunteer comes into the room. He's got the good guy giving good instructions on his right, bad guy giving bad instructions on his left. And they say, go. And everybody starts shouting and cheering, and it's chaos again, but the volunteer with the correct instruction put his arm around the blindfolded volunteer and spoke directly into his ear. And almost without hesitation, the volunteer started moving in the right direction. And occasionally, he would pause to listen as the opposition frantically tried to get him to turn around. But with the gentle guidance of touch, just a soft touch on the arm or a reassuring pat in the right direction, the one with the vital message led him in the correct direction. But as he got closer to his goal, as the person started to move towards the back of the auditorium, everybody else who up until this point had been shouting their own instructions, suddenly they start working together, chanting in unison, trying to keep the volunteer from accomplishing their goal. So they start chanting, don't go, don't go. But with the reassuring touch of the volunteer giving the correct instructions, not forcing, just reassuring contact, the volunteer continued to go to the back. They got to the back of the auditorium. There was one final instruction, a moment of hesitation, and then the volunteer, the blindfolded volunteer, threw his arms around the instructor, and the whole room erupted in cheers and applause. College students can get pretty excited about what they're doing. They interviewed the blindfolded volunteer after, and a couple of things became very clear. Number 1, if you want people to hear you, you got to get close. You've got to get close to people. Shouting at them from the auditorium, shouting at them from the pews, doesn't work. You got to get close to people for them to hear you. And second, if you really seek life-changing commitment from people in the world, you have to reach out where they are and in love, gently touch their life. You have to change their world. You have to reach out into their world. We have to help people. They asked the volunteer, why did you continue to go in the right direction even when everyone was chanting? And he paused, and then he answered, he said, because it felt like he was the only one who cared. Even with the entire room chanting, go the other way, the calm, reassuring physical contact was the most comforting thing. He felt like he was the only one who really cared where he was going. You draw close to people, touch their lives, and you can change the world. Step 1, tell people about Jesus. Then you got to back that up by helping them, actually helping them. With those 2 things, you can literally transform the world. I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and I have seen it done really well, and I have seen it done really poorly. And I believe with all of my heart that this place is a place that can do this really well. Whatever else is going on in our world, we can do it really well in this place. We could change people's lives. And so let me leave you with this. May you seek God's righteousness found in Jesus. Don't make up your own system of rules for the world. May you tell people about Jesus with words from your mouth. And finally, may you actually help people, give them both Band-Aids and healing. Amen.